very passionate about. Today I'll be talking to you about fusing facts and feelings to motivate action on climate change. But let me start with two huge challenges that we're facing. The first is we really need to stabilize carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere to limit warming. And the second is that we've already started to warm and we need to figure out how to do deep adaptation to figure out how to deal with some of these climate change impacts that are already starting to happen to limit welfare loss. So today I'll be focusing on both of these, but I'll be also switching back and forth between the activist Shaz as well as the researcher Shaz. So to start us off with what is the challenge here today, the challenge is that our emissions have been going up over time. And in order for our emissions to match what we need in order to stabilize concentration, we actually need our emissions to be significantly lowered in order to reach this 1.5 degree C goal that we have in order to stabilize CO2 concentration so that we limit warming. Now, trying to figure out a very simple heuristic in order to understand this data, you can just imagine that we need our carbon dioxide emissions to go to zero in order to stabilize concentration. So our emissions are pretty high right now, especially for the state of Indiana, and Janet set us up really well for this. In terms of our carbon-based fossil fuels, and this is Indiana's current energy mix by consumption, our carbon-based fossil fuels total to around 94%, whereas our low carbon fuels total to around 7%. So we don't actually have any nuclear, but this number, we actually need to sort of almost reverse these two numbers. So that is a huge task that we have ahead for our state. But what can you do? And this is sort of the activist side of me. I think we all collectively need to do everything in our power to address this huge challenge ahead of us. That means talking to our friends and our neighbors about climate change and why it's important, changing our own behavior in terms of effective actions, and I'll be talking about that in a minute, and also going from being a climate person, where this is an important problem that we have to deal with and reckon with in everything that we do, to sort of thinking about a climate commitment, which is a framework where you ask yourself, all right, I've done this thing, what is the next thing that I can do next? And always try to think about what is the next thing that you can do, rather than saying, all right, I've done my part, I've turned off the lights, I'm good. So this is a quote from Mary Anais Hegler, and she says, do what you're good at and do your best. And if you're good at making noise, make as much noise as you can. So I wanted to start off the talk talking about that, and then now switch to some more of my research. So ever since I was a researcher as a PhD student, I've been thinking about two separate modes of trying to understand individual behavior and how individual behavior can shape the system. Now, when you think about individual behavior, we actually need two things. It's not that people don't have the right information, it's that they might not have the right information, but they also might not be effectively motivated by the problem. So we need to combine information and motivation in order to effectively motivate action on climate change. In terms of some of my prior research, we have asked participants online, in your opinion, what is the most effective thing you could do to conserve energy in your life? And surprisingly, the #1 response that we've seen is turning off the lights. Now, turning off the lights is great, but it's not a very effective behavior. And unfortunately, this behavior has stuck since the 1980s, when Willett Kempton first asked the same question. So behaviors that are easiest to remember and perform, such as turning off the lights when leaving the room, tend to have minimal impacts on climate change. So we need to first move away from this cognitive foothold that turning off the lights has, and move towards behaviors that are much more effective when it comes to our individual consumption, change people around us, and then change our state, and then hopefully change the world. And it doesn't have to go in that order. So going back, there are two separate types of heuristics that I'd like to talk about today. One is a cultural heuristic, which is what culture tells us is important. And turning off the light is a cultural heuristic. But there are also natural heuristics, which come from thinking and decision-making research. And one of the natural heuristics that I'll be talking about today is anchoring an insufficient adjustment. So if there's a number out there, people will anchor on that number, even if it's irrelevant, and focus on that when they're trying to make estimates when asked. So some of my prior research has looked at how do people perceive how much energy different appliances use in the home. And over here on your y-axis, you have people's perceptions of energy used in watt hours. And on your x-axis, you have actual energy used in watt hours. And what you see here is that a lot of the data lies below the diagonal line, and the diagonal line is where y is equal to x. So some of these actions, and this is how much energy is used by the dishwasher in an hour, are underestimated by orders of magnitude. So the question that we have, especially trying to figure out how to correct these misperceptions, is can we hold onto this curve and pull it up towards the diagonal? Now, one path would be to teach people energy physics and have them do the calculation very basically. But another way of doing this is actually by providing people with expert heuristics in order to replace these cultural heuristics that are really problematic. One expert heuristic that we tested was large appliances that primarily heat and cool things use a lot more energy than people think. So would this change the way people perceive how much energy is used? And we actually find that it does. So imagine that really shallow slope. We're actually able to make it much more steep by using that expert heuristic. So this is the baseline, which was a replication of our prior work. This is how much it improves with the heuristic. And this is how much it improves with giving multiple anchor points along the line. And when you provide both, the curve is the steepest of them all. But what we found is that the heuristic actually also improves downstream behavioral choices. So if I give people two behaviors, one is very effective and one isn't, they're much more likely to pick the effective behavior in the heuristic condition than they are in the anchor condition. So our current work is actually trying to look at how can we break apart these faulty heuristics and how can we create and encourage useful heuristics based on expert elicitations that are being conducted and analyzed at the moment by our team. The next piece of, the next paper I'd like to talk to you about just came out 2 weeks ago, and it looks at how do people envision the future energy system in the United States. So we asked participants what they think the current energy mix is and what they hope the future energy mix would be in 2050. And when I use the term energy mix, as I did earlier, I mean energy sources used for electric power, transportation, industry, commercial, and residential. So this is our current energy mix in the United States, and this is the entire United States. And oil is number one, followed by natural gas and coal, then nuclear, biomass, hydroelectricity, wind, solar, and geothermal. So that's our current energy mix. And here is the data, and I'm going to walk you through it. And this is current and future energy estimates by energy source and political ideology. So what we find is for oil and natural gas, participants underestimate these two resources. Participants slightly overestimate coal, and they significantly overestimate wind and solar. Now looking at what participants want the future energy mix to look like, and this is some great news. In the future, conservatives and liberals want a really severely decarbonized future. So they want a significant decrease in oil, significant decrease in natural gas and coal, and huge increases in wind and solar energy. So this is great. We all collectively, conservatives and liberals, hope for a decarbonized future energy mix. So this is amazing news. Now we need to figure out how to get there. So the challenging part is we do not agree on the policy pathways to get us to these decarbonized futures. When asked about 6 separate decarbonizing policies and 6 anti-decarbonizing policies, you can see that there are significant differences between conservatives, shown in red, and liberals, shown in blue. So for example, for a carbon tax, liberals much more strongly prefer it than conservatives. There's relatively equal support for nuclear across the board, but in general, for the decarbonizing policies, you can see this upward trend where there's a lot more support by liberals than by conservatives. You see the opposite trend for the anti-decarbonizing policies, where in general, there's a lot stronger opposition by liberals than by conservatives for things like relaxing drilling regulations, constructing oil pipelines, investing in new coal plants, so on and so forth. So we need to figure out how to share this vision. Even though we have a shared vision of a future, we need to figure out how to have shared pathways of getting there. When asked what is the most important issue by political ideology across spatial and temporal scales, we asked participants, what is the most important problem in the USA today? For 4 separate problems: climate change, economy and jobs, access to quality healthcare, and immigration. And what we find is that for the United States today, liberals find that climate change and access to quality healthcare are really important problems, whereas much stronger agreement for conservatives for economy and jobs. However, what we find also is that there's an upward trend for climate change, whereas there's a relatively flat trend for all of the 3 other problems. So in general, climate change is a futures problem. This is the world in the future and the US in the future. It's considered to be a futures problem. And it's also considered to be a problem that's faced by other places rather than where we are at. So how do you compress time and space? That is something we're working on in our lab, not the physics side, but more of the psychological side. So stay tuned. So in terms of summarizing this past paper that just came out, the great news is conservatives and liberals want a decarbonized future. There's a significant decrease in fossil fuel use and a significant increase in solar and wind. But the tough news is that there's strong differences between liberals and conservatives in their support for these policies to achieve this future. Now I want to take a step back and situate some of our climate change discussion within the coronavirus pandemic that we're experiencing right now. So Google recently released some mobility data, and this is part of their mobility report where you can play with some of this data at this website. And what we can see is that there's severe downward trends when it comes to things like transit stations, workplace transit, going to the groceries and pharmacy, retail and recreation. And that has actually led to a decrease in emissions right now. But the challenge is this decrease in emissions comes at a huge personal and societal cost. And in general, I do not think that it's going to stick past this pandemic, because the changes that need to be made need to, by design, need to be structural rather than forced upon society in the manner that they are right now in order to save lives. So after COVID, there are 2 paths that we have. Emissions can come roaring back if nations lean heavily on old, dirty energy sources, or strong government support for clean energy could tilt economies in a greener, more climate-friendly direction. And to quote this in a much more feelings method, I want to end my talk today by one of my favorite authors, Arundhati Roy. And she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I look forward to engaging with all of your questions, and I'm so excited to be here and be part of this discussion today with all of you. Thank you so much.